So anyway, you know, over the years, when Armstrong was appeared at various events and that, invariably some reporter would say, "Hey, now what was that Mr. Gronsky? What that Mr. Gronsky comment?" And for years and years he said, "No comment." Well, eventually, Mr. Gronsky died, and Armstrong was asked about it. He said, "Okay, now that he's dead, I can tell you the story." He said, "You know, I grew up in Ohio, in a small town in Ohio. You know, the Gronskys were our next door neighbors, and we used to play ball, and sometimes the ball would, you know, go over into their yard. And, you know, this one night, we were playing, and, you know, my friend hit the ball, and I was out in the field, and it went over, and it went right up, you know, right up to Gronsky's house, right under, you know, under one of the windows that just happened to be open. And I bent down to pick up the ball, and I could tell that they were fighting. And I paused for a little while and listened, and Mrs. Gronsky said, "Sex? You want sex? You'll get sex, you know, when the kid next door walks on the moon." So anyway, I feel like, you know, I feel about as lucky as Gronsky, you know, having had a chance to do a lecture in Portage, Wisconsin. Let me get on to the topic, I guess, before we all like break into a hot sweat. You know, 179 years ago, this was the place at the very center of the storm, almost at the center of the storm. This is the place where, you know, Juliet Kinsey was in a tizzy about, gosh, you know, the Indians coming and burning the place down and scalping everybody, and because in fact they've done that in a number of places in Illinois. And so she packed it up and went to Green Bay until the storm blew over. But John remained behind, and indeed Portage remained a kind of a central hub in the war. In fact, Atkinson and Dodge and the Army had kind of rendezvoused here after they chased Blackhawk and his band out of the swamps around what later becomes Fort Atkinson, down around, you know, Whitewater, the University of Wisconsin Whitewater. Well, the Blackhawk War, you know, the Blackhawk War ends up being a fairly important part of early Wisconsin history. And it was a conflict that was precipitated when Blackhawk, an old man at the time, and 1,600 Sauk Indians, crossed over the Mississippi River in early April of 1832 from Iowa into Illinois, and then headed up the east bank of the Mississippi River, intending to return to Saucon. Saucon was their summertime village, and village would be probably an almost inappropriate word, because when everybody was home, when they all come in from the winter hunts, when they'd migrated back from almost the center and the western part of Iowa during the winters, there were about 8,000 people who lived in Saucon, and there were vast gardens and cornfields and pastures for a large herd of horses, and up on the bluff there was a cemetery, so that, you know, every spring when the people returned from the winter hunt, they brought the dead back with them, so they could all be part of the community forever. And so the dead were buried on the hill. And why a village there at the confluence, almost the confluence of the Rock and the Mississippi rivers? And the reason is what I alluded to in my opening comments about Portage being, you know, where the veil is real thin. The fact of the matter is, the Sauk were convinced that Saucon was built at the very center of the world. The center of the world where the music of the drum would communicate up through the universe to the spiritual world. And that it was a place of powerful magic. It was a place of powerful magic where the corn always grew and the horses always multiplied, and people married in the summer and increased the size of the society. So it was where, you know, the essence of Saukness happened. It was the best place in the world to live, and, you know, really for a long time. In fact, up until 1822. The Sauk were one of the most prosperous Native American societies in the middle of the country. A large population which, unlike all the other populations in the region, Indian populations in the region, at a time when Americans were pronouncing the Indians to be the vanishing Americans, the Sauk continued to multiply and increase in population. There was no hunger there. There was no conflict there. I mean, wow, you know? And it was the place where they thrived because they derived power, magical power, from that place. Well, the fact of the matter is that in the early summer of 1831, the Sauk had been banished from Saukko'nak by the United States Army. Banished to Iowa, and if you've ever been to Iowa, you've been to South Dakota. Iowa is almost the same, but if you've ever been to Iowa, what the hell? You know, who'd ever want to be banished to Iowa? Everybody I know from Iowa, there's a lot of people in Iowa that go into education, and none of them ever go back. So they were banished to Iowa, and they were told never, ever, on pain of death, to cross over the Mississippi River again. And in the winter of 1831 and 1832, there was hunger in the camp, and there was death in the lodges, and they languished and faded and feared for the continued existence. And in the spring, following Blackhawk, half the tribes, about half the tribes, saddled up, packed their bags, and followed him back in defiance of the United States government across the Mississippi River, and were headed home to Saukko'nak again to regenerate themselves. Well, you know, that crossing of the Mississippi River, of course, set a chain reaction in motion, and pretty soon there was a panic among the white settlers in Illinois, and even further up into the driftless area of Wisconsin. And eventually, that panic turned into a violent conflict. Turned into a war. A war that forever changed the upper Mississippi River Valley, and forever changed the course of Wisconsin history. The consequences of the Blackhawk War were pretty far-reaching, in fact. But by almost any measure, the Blackhawk War could be defined as a very modest military conflict, at least in terms of what this country normally experiences. You know, it only lasted 15 weeks. I mean, when was the last time we had a war that lasted 15 weeks? I mean, how long have we been in Iraq? And, you know, what's the calendar say about Afghanistan? It only lasted 15 weeks. It claimed the lives of fewer than 100 Americans. Of course, killed off a lot of Indians, but it resulted in the deaths of fewer than 100 Americans. And it was a war that cost the United States government less than $6 million. Now, in military terms, $6 million is just loose change. And yet, since the end of that war, almost since the beginning of the end of that war, there's been this steady outpouring of books and articles and plays and poems, some of them even epic poems, written about the war and the countryside of southwestern Wisconsin. And I suppose northwestern Illinois to some degree. Just bristles. If you've ever been there, it just bristles with plaques and monuments commemorating the conflict. Furthermore, that region is filled with almost countless parks, schools, credit unions, hotels, country clubs, athletic teams, dry cleaners, and even colleges that have all named themselves after the long-departed Sauk leader, Blackhawk. So why? I mean, and certainly during the war, Blackhawk was the villain. I mean, Blackhawk was evil incarnate. But boy, you know, dry cleaners and credit unions are really proud to, be the Blackhawk Credit Union. And I remember the first time I took a student field trip to Prairie du Chien, there was a sign saying home of the Prairie du Chien Blackhawk state football champs. So, you know, it's become a positive identity. Well, why, you might wonder, had the Blackhawk War had such a deep and enduring impression on our collective memory? You know, why? Why has the story of the Blackhawk War been told and retold so many times, including, I think my book was, I think the 19th sort of major, like, kind of, you know, good publisher sort of book written about the Blackhawk War. I mean, how many times do you have to look it over? I mean, I admitted I was a historical junkie and could do tours over and over again, but you know, why? Well, the historian Robert Ferguson observes that, quote, every culture has 5 or 6 stories that it tells itself over and over again as part of a pattern of self-recognition and sought after cohesion. In other words, it's through such stories that people derive a sense of collective identity and explain to themselves and explain to the broader world how they became who they imagined themselves to be. I mean, we always do that with history, right? I mean, why do we have so many books coming out in the last, you know, maybe the last 6, 7 years about the founding fathers? Well, we're trying to like retell the story of, you know, where we came from and how we got to be what we are, or what we imagine ourselves. So, in the case of the Blackhawk War, you know, as a result of, you know, my thinking about it for a long time, I've come to the conclusion that it was the conflict that is Wisconsin's primal creation myth. The Blackhawk War is Wisconsin's creation myth, which tells the story of the violent, cataclysmic beginnings of ourselves as a distinct place and a distinct people. Therefore, in our collective identity, the Blackhawk War is kind of the big bang that created Wisconsin. At least began the creation of Wisconsin. Well, you know, so why would I say that? Well, I don't know if any of you ever read Wallace Stegner. Wallace Stegner is dead now, but he was, you know, he's a very, very fine regional historian. His region happens to be the West. But Wallace Stegner once declared, in terms of people having a sense of place, and the place having a sort of an instinctive identity, that no place is a place until things that have happened in it are remembered in history, ballads, yarns, legends, and monuments. The truth is, he asserts, a place is more than half memory. Well, before the Blackhawk War, we have very few shared memories of Wisconsin. And none of the memories we have of pre-1832, none of them are very big or dramatic. None of them are very memorable, in fact. Indeed, before 1832, it seemed to be a place, Wisconsin seemed to be a place, without history, where the Indians and a few French people lived in existence in the state of nature, caught up in the endless cycles of the natural world, going nowhere, creating nothing that moved their world forward along a progressive course towards a better future. I mean, you know, that's our view, I guess, of history. I mean, it's always moving ahead, right? It's always, the future is always up there, and, you know, but people who live in nature, it's like it's all got to do with the cycles. And moving ahead to a better condition is like, oh, come on, you know? I mean, people that lived in Saukanack were saying, how could it ever be better than this? But for us, Wisconsin was a place without history before 1832. And all of a sudden, the first big dramatic event that we ever experienced, back there in the kind of the forests and the driftless area, was this conflict. And that sort of endless repeating of the cycles changed abruptly, explosively and violently, as it so often does in America, right? Explosively and violently. Once Blackhawk and his followers crossed the fatherly waters. Now, the story that emerges from what happened that hot, rain-soaked summer of 1832, and it seemed the summer where it rained all the time. The story that emerges from that summer is a narrative that is dominated by three major characters. The three major characters are Blackhawk. Let's just leave him up here. You know, this is a pretty nice picture of Blackhawk. You know, there's almost, I think, nearly 40 portraits of Blackhawk, and none of them look like they're paintings of the same guy. In fact, there's another painting right here that's Blackhawk. Now compare. It's like, my God, will the real Blackhawk stand up? You have to be old, you know, get punchline. So the first major player in the drama is Blackhawk. Second, Henry Atkinson, and third, Henry Dodge. And in the narrative, all three are generally depicted as larger than life. Now, Blackhawk, I'll start with Blackhawk. And there's something ironic about saying, oh, larger than life in reference to Blackhawk, because, you know, Blackhawk was a pipsqueak of a man. Blackhawk was not larger than life, and was once described by one observer as, quote, rather small in stature and very slight in physical build. Blackhawk weighed about 125 pounds, and you know, and when he had his spine all straightened out, he hardly stood more than 5 foot 4 inches tall. Now, you know, being small, he never seemed to be a handicapped in Napoleon. You know, being small, it may not be a big deal, but in addition to that, you know, Blackhawk held no official position of authority within the Sauk tribe. He wasn't a chief. He wasn't a shaman. He wasn't a medicine man. I mean, he wasn't anything. He had no authority whatsoever. And besides all that, to just sort of add to the, you know, the diminutive nature of the man, he was very mediocre in terms of oratorical and political skills. I mean, the man who was like the silver-tongued devil, who was his rival, was an actual chief by the name of Keokuk. And Keokuk was slick in politics and inspiring every time he spoke. And Keokuk ended up a rich man with a lot of land in Iowa. But Blackhawk just didn't seem to be anything much more than the kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of the Sauk man. And in fact, you know, he was once described as being, quote, an individual in no wise gifted with any uncommon physical, moral, or intellectual endowment. Well, in his youth, he'd been quite an accomplished warrior, and in fact had won a reputation for a great deal of personal courage. But you know, in 1862, he was 65 years old. I mean, his best days were way behind him, you know, and in fact, you know, he was well past his prime, and his natural powers, such as his eyesight, were beginning to really fade. Nevertheless, even with those limitations, he became the leader of considerable influence and appeal. That did not arise from who he was or what he was, but it arose rather from the fact of what he stood for and appeared to represent. See, Blackhawk in many ways was a living metaphor. So what did he represent? Well, he was a staunch, unwavering traditionalist who remained true and faithful to the old ways and the old values. He never drank alcohol. He never dressed in white people's clothes. He never spoke in any language other than song. He was faithful. He faithfully kept the old rituals and faithfully kept the old traditions. And he held steady to his softness. In fact, in 1831, when there's this council at Fort Armstrong, which is very close to where Stockenham is located. The general was going on, like a broken bagpipe, and Blackhawk objects to something, and the general says, "Who are you? Who are you? How dare you interrupt me?" And Blackhawk stands up, doesn't give his name. Blackhawk stands up and says, "I am a sock!" As if, boy, once you had heard that, you needed to know more about his identity. So he held steady to his softness, and rather than that making him an anachronism, just kind of an eccentric old man, it gave him symbolic significance. In fact, as I said, Blackhawk, by that, became a living metaphor. So that in contrast to most of the other men of the society, he was a man with a very clear and well-defined identity within a society that was caught up in a course of steep downward decline and disintegration. As I mentioned, up until 1832, the Sauk had done very, very well. The population increased, they had a very prosperous and complex economy. They weren't just hunting and gathering. They were, in fact, growing so much surplus corn that they sold it in the market. They made tremendous amounts of money or trade goods by producing maple sugar. And they cut themselves in on a very lucrative and expanding feather trade. It was the time when people were putting feathers in their comforters and feathers in their pillows, and the Sauk harvested feathers. And so they were very, very prosperous until 1832, until the American Fur Company moved in and transformed the fur trade into something pretty ugly. And then, about 1825, did I say 22? 22, 1820. The American Fur Company moved in. And at about 1825, a gold rush started. A lead rush started in the driftless area in northwestern Illinois and southwestern Wisconsin. And people on the hustle. Times were tough back east. It was one of those recession times following, Andrew Jackson's second election. So people rushed in. That's why they call it a lead rush, I guess. People rushed into the region. A region that up until then had been exclusively Sauk territory. Well, cultural and economic decline and disintegration brought on within the Sauk society, within the Sauk individuals, a real crisis of confidence and a considerable amount of personal confusion and psychological pain. And in the midst of all that, Blackhawk stood unchanged and unchanging, the real personification of the tribe's collective identity. Blackhawk was seen by his followers. Blackhawk was seen as being what a real Sauk man ought to be. And what they all had once been, and they all wanted to become again. So he became their model, their beacon in the chaos. And it was that, in the midst of all these people feeling a real sense of panic about disappearing, becoming extinct as a distinctive culture, that 1,600 of them saddled up in the early spring of 1832 and followed him in defiance of the American government back across the Mississippi River, and back they hoped to the center of the world where they could tap in on this power. So what they were doing is they were looking for redemption, cultural redemption, and regeneration. And the fact that there were women and children and old people that went along pretty clearly indicated that Blackhawk did not have war on his mind. They were just going home to save themselves. All right. Well, they never were allowed to settle back into the old village. And so Blackhawk and the band continued up, hoping to find refuge among the Potawatomi or the Winnebago, the Ho-Chunk, up the Rock River Valley. And when that was no longer going to be the case, and knowing that there were people on their trail, people with violence in their mind on their trail, they took up and they crossed over at what now is Beloit into the Michigan Territory, which later becomes Wisconsin. Go through where the city of Beloit is now, then through Janesville, and then to Lake Koshkonong, which was surrounded by a large area of swamp, of heavy duty, reed beds and swamp, and decided to hide out in an area that they assumed was inaccessible to white guys. To hide out until the trouble blew over, and then to sneak back, cross the river again, and vanish into Iowa. Well, that didn't happen, and the primary tactic used by Blackhawk in that march, that long and increasingly hungry and exhausting march, was to play the trickster, to avoid confrontation, to be seen and then to become invisible, to change form. Like the trickster is a shape shifter, a shape changer. And so it was just like, wow, just confuse them with knowing the country really well and being able to appear and disappear, etc., etc. And then when it really started to heat up, small war bands were sent out to attack farms and small villages along the frontier, mostly in Illinois, because there weren't farms and small villages for the most part in Wisconsin. There were some mining camps or mining communities. One at Blue Mound and another one. In that whole area there were quite a few, but most of the attacks are made in northern Illinois. And when you don't have numbers and you don't have equipment, and you're really working at a disadvantage, what you do is you maximize what you can do. And what Blackhawk decided to do was to maximize his impact by carrying out a war of terror on these isolated farms, mining camps, and small agricultural villages in northern Illinois. Just scared the hell out of them. In fact, many of the people living in Illinois took off to Chicago, just packed it up and left and went to Chicago. And Chicago was this huge. When the Kinseys first went to Chicago, I think there were like 300 people living in the quote-unquote city. Saukenock was the largest human settlement in the upper Mississippi Valley. Chicago, 300 people. All of a sudden, Chicago had 5 and 6 and 7 and as high as 10,000 people. And in Chicago, in the summer of 1832, it was a horrendous cholera epidemic. So what the terrorist warfare did is it worked. It bought him time. it did the shapeshifter thing. It's just like, wow, you know, people were bedding down for the night feeling safe and secure, and then all of a sudden, you know, their house was on fire and their hair was gone. And there was, you know, there was some pretty ghoulish things done in those raids. Which only, of course, increased the panic and increased the call for decisive action. Which leads us to the second guy. It's a fine-looking guy here, right? Henry Atkinson. You know, when it first started, when the word was that the Indians had come back to Illinois, the man that was sent to save the day, to deal with the situation, was Henry Atkinson, Brigadier General Henry Atkinson, who had been a professional soldier since the War of 1812. In fact, by 1832, he'd been in the military as a professional officer for 24 years, half of that time he'd spent on the frontier. So this was a guy who knew what was going on along the Mississippi River. This is a guy that knew the people, that knew the territory, that you know, knew the temperament, and you know, Henry Atkinson was regarded as a pretty good professional soldier. He had a meticulous. He was a meticulous, middle-aged career officer who was the sixth son of a very prosperous North Carolina plantation family, and who during his career acquired a reputation for being careful, cautious, and exceedingly well-organized. Now, isn't that all spit and polish? I mean, isn't that sort of like, you know, what soldiers are supposed to be? Also, he had a lot of dealings with Indians. And in those dealings, he got a reputation among the Indians, and certainly among the other people out there, for being fair-minded and humane. And in fact, Atkinson more often than anything else intervened on behalf of the Indians in situations where their interests or their rights under the treaties were being threatened by settlers and miners and, you know, Yaha guys that were just, you know, trying to cut themselves in on a good time and, you know, some easy money. So Atkinson got the reputation for being, you know, being a fair-minded defender of, you know, what was right. I mean, boy, we're getting a picture here of like kind of Captain America, right? So Atkinson was respected by the tribal people. And, you know, as a man, Atkinson was polite, soft-spoken, a non-drinker in a profession that was awash with whiskey. He was a solid, dependable, responsible man, but he wasn't flashy, he wasn't flamboyant, there was nothing heroic about Henry Atkinson except maybe his sideburns, and he had not a single glimmer of charisma. But Atkinson really believed that he could deal with the situation. And Atkinson set forth from Jefferson Barracks, which was just south of St. Louis, got his troops up on keelboats, and figured that the situation could be handled kind of quickly. But in dealing with that, Atkinson had some limitations. Number one, when he came up the river at the end of April 1832, he brought with him only 220 soldiers. 220 soldiers. How many Sauk were there? 1,600, right? So 220 soldiers. The other thing, you may think this is peculiar, but all of the soldiers on those keelboats, all of the soldiers that were brought up to deal with the Indian problem, they were all infantry soldiers. They were all foot soldiers. They all traveled on their feet. Why was that? Well, because the United States Army did not have a cavalry at the time, certainly no cavalry in the West. And therefore, what you've got is you've got 220 foot soldiers who have to deal with 1,600 Sauk Indians, all of whom, at least all the warriors of whom, were on horseback. Able to travel vast distances, able to travel at great speeds, certainly in comparison to Atkins and his guys. So, God, can you imagine, trying to run across Illinois to catch up with these people on horseback? So, number one, 220 soldiers, all earthbound, all footsore. And the other problem is that Atkinson and his men were totally dependent for all their necessities on a long supply line of very slow, heavy, cumbersome wagons hauled by oxen. Now you can say, oh my God, this is just absolutely not going to work at all, right? It's like, not enough guys, the wrong equipment, the wrong sort of approach, etc., etc. But Atkinson had only dealt with Indians a couple times in violent situations, and one had been during what was called the Winnebago War in 1827, and he'd ended that with a minimum of violence. So Atkinson set off with his 120 soldiers, headed up the river from Jefferson Barracks, and even with those limitations, he was very confident he could deal with the problem. And Atkinson made it his mission to keep the peace. To keep the peace. Rather than to wage a war. He sought to avoid violence, and if violence couldn't be avoided altogether, he wanted to minimize it, and he wanted to minimize the loss of life or injury to both sides. And therefore, Atkinson saw himself as a peacekeeper. He didn't see himself as a war maker. He probably would have approached it a slightly different way if he had thought, oh, wow, I'm going to go up there and, make a war. And he really honestly believed that he could appeal to Blackhawk's reason and convince Blackhawk and the Sauk to leave the Eastern Territory and go back to Iowa quietly and peaceably before, anything big hit the fan. And the fact is he was almost 100% off. Because by early May, Blackhawk and his band had run really low on supplies. They couldn't get support from the Potawatomi and the Winnebago. They were already up past Dixon Ferry at the time. Dixon. Okay, who grew up in Dixon, Illinois? Ronald Reagan. All right. So they were already up past Dixon, and Blackhawk had a council, and he decided that the smart thing to do was to surrender to Atkinson, have a military escort back down the Rock River Valley, back over into safe territory in Iowa. It almost worked. What happened? Why didn't it work? It didn't work because 1832, now this is a question I often ask my students, what possibly other than, something like this could be happening in 1832? 1832. What happens in the United States in years that end in 2? Or 0, or 4, or 1832 was an election year. 1832 was an election year. And guess what? Everybody running for office, even Abraham Lincoln, who was running for county office. They wanted to get a reputation for themselves. They wanted to be like Big He-Man, to the voters. They wanted to be, superstars in their own time. And the best way to get a reputation in Illinois was to kill yourself some Indians. So what happens is that Atkinson, who's into control, you know, he's going to be a peacekeeper. And Blackhawk, who's like saying, man, this isn't going to work. I mean, nothing's happened the way we thought. So best give up, you know, surrender Atkinson. Why? Because, well, he's a guy, he's got a reputation for being humane and cool. And go back to Iowa before we get killed. But before that could happen, a battle took place. A battle that becomes known as Stillman's Run. A battle that becomes known as Stillman's Run in northern Illinois. And what happens in Stillman's Run is, just let me use the language. The Indians kicked the shit out of the Americans. I mean, the Indians just humiliated the Illinois militia, which in fact, you know, takes off in panic and runs all the way through the night, all the way back to Dixon, saying that they'd encountered a force of several thousand well-armed Indians, and you know, after that, you know, it's a little like, you know, you can kill Custer one year, but you know, you defeat the Americans, and they are going to come back and get you, right? They are going to come back and get you. They have to avenge the insult, the humiliation, the embarrassment. I mean, think of all those aspiring politicians who were kind of embarrassed by what happened, you know, rather than you know, plummeted into political office. Plummeted into, that's the wrong word. Propelled into political office. Right. So Atkinson does not have the right stuff. I mean, he has almost the right stuff. But because of his passive approach, because of his slow and plodding and indecisive progress, Atkinson was harshly criticized. In fact, President Andrew Jackson, who won his reputation as an Indian fighter, becomes exasperated and comes to regard Atkinson as just an imbecile and a coward. And besides that, all the people that want to run for office, or are running for office in 1832, are calling for action, heroic action, to put a decisive end to what's going on with these Indians, you know, right away. So, Atkinson gets passed on. Now, the one person who played the situation like a good hand of poker is Henry Dodge. Henry Dodge was the person who most reflected the public frustration and who did the most to turn it into a violent conflict. And in the end, it was Henry Dodge, more than anyone else, who emerged from the conflict as the most heroic figure. And that's just exactly what Dodge wanted to do. That's what he set out to do. I mean, he wasn't really too worried about the Indians, but it was a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for Dodge. Now, who was Henry Dodge? Well, Henry Dodge was the son of a man from Connecticut who served in the Continental Army under General Washington, who after the Revolutionary War was over, had headed, like so many soldiers, had headed west and had settled for a while in Vincennes, Indiana. And that's where Henry Dodge was born, in Vincennes, Indiana, in 1782. Well, you know, knowing something about the frontier, it wasn't too long before Henry's father, a man by the name of Israel Dodge, deserted the family. Just deserted the family. And so Dodge gets the distinction like Andrew Jackson, almost like Andrew Jackson, like so many rising political stars of the early 19th century, as being a semi-orphan or being an orphan. And so he grew up with his mother on the frontier. They moved to Kentucky for a while, and then at age 14, think of it, at age 14, like Huck Finn, Henry Dodge struck out for the territory. Henry Dodge moved to Missouri. The Missouri Territory, which was just beginning to kind of, acquire a population, at least an Anglo population. And there, Henry Dodge met up with his father again, and there Henry Dodge made his living as a deputy sheriff, and then as a U.S. Marshal during the War of 1812. I mean, what could be better? I mean, you could do a TV show out of this, couldn't you? And then, for a while after the War of 1812, he was a salt maker at the mouth of the Saline River in Missouri. Now, salt, of course, was absolutely a necessity of life. I mean, you couldn't preserve pork or anything else unless you had lots of salt. And so Henry Dodge, tapped into this river that had a high salt content and evaporated the water in pans and sold the salt at a real high price. Began to make some money. And one of his daughters, to show how the salt making thing, left an impression on him. One of his daughters, who lived a very long time and has all kinds of interesting stories about the Dodge family, her name was Selina Dodge, Salty Dodge. But Henry was sort of making his way in the world, and then in 1827, he decided to make the move to the big time. In 1827, he decided to move to Galena, Illinois, when the lead rush was in total fever and frenzy. He would go there, he would strike it rich, he would find lead, he would and he would rise in the world and acquire a name for himself and amount to somebody. So they moved in the summer of 1827. They moved in the summer of 1827 to Galena, Illinois, on the Fever River. Henry, his wife, Christiana, their 9 children, along with Henry's numerous slaves and a large herd of horses and cattle, moved up the east bank of the Mississippi River and moved into Galena. But the problem was that by 1827, most of the good claims were already taken. So Henry hung around the rest of the summer, and then in November moved into the Michigan Territory, into Winnebago land, east of Prairie du Chien, about 40 miles east of Prairie du Chien, close to the Wisconsin River, and established a mining camp, which he, kind of immodestly named Dodgeville. And Dodgeville really was, in describing it in the book, the image I have is sort of like an early medieval castle. I mean, there's this palisade, this huge palisade, and he really hits it big in terms of lead. Then they've got a smelter going there. They're cutting down the trees and burning the hardwood wood and smelting the lead out of the ore, and a number of shafts and a large number of workers and hangers-on. And everybody is armed. Everybody is armed because, hey, they're in Indian territory, and in fact, they're in territory where they're not supposed to be. And in fact, Colonel Zachary Taylor from Prairie du Chien, from Fort Crawford to Prairie du Chien, tries to get Dodge out of there, but fails. Dodge is way too dug in, way too massively armed, and way too determined to become the richest man in Wisconsin. So Dodge is cool. And Dodge is cool in all kinds of ways. First of all, Dodge is a very attractive man. Do we have a Dodge picture? Do we? Do we have the Dodge picture? Oh, we have the old Dodge picture. I got a CD that's got Henry Dodge dressed. Here's Dodge when he's old. But when he's young, and God, nobody can tell his age. You know, in 1832, Henry Dodge was 50 years old, and everybody is saying he's in his late 30s. Why? Because Dodge was in incredible shape. I mean, he was pumping iron or something. Because he was in incredible shape. He was tall. He was straight. He was strong, and he had a long, thick mane of dark hair, and appeared to be, 15 years younger than he really was. Along with that, along with his kind of well-toned physical condition, Dodge had an unusually strong personality. This was a guy who didn't take no for an answer. This was a guy who, if you were looking at, if you rode into Dodgeville, you could tell in a minute who was in charge. Who was in charge. Strong personality. And Dodge was pushy, but he was one of those pushy guys who nevertheless was really respected. I mean, people thought, oh, God, Henry, this Dodge guy is just cool. And Dodge projected from head to toe an almost idealized image of a muscle-bound, weather-worn ward frontiersman who dressed in a tanned buckskin hunting shirt and had 2 pistols strapped to his hips. And this was Clint Eastwood before he was, a glimmer in anybody's eye. I mean, this was the High Plains drifter who nobody messed with and everybody respected. So what do we got here? Well, we've got symbols, right? We've got symbols. We've got another metaphor. You see, while Blackhawk was sort of the symbol of what sockness was, Blackhawk was this living, embodied metaphor of what a good sock man was supposed to be. Well, Henry Dodge was seen in the eyes of his Western compatriots as what an American man ought to be. And therefore, Henry Dodge personified their collective identity. The collective identity of the people in the Mississippi frontier area, used to kind of define and describe who they were, or at least who they wanted to be, or who they imagined themselves to be. And the Blackhawk War is an awful lot about people imagining themselves to be something. Maybe all wars are a little like that. Huh? So, it was that, as it had been in Blackhawk's case, that attracted attention and attracted people to Henry Dodge. And Dodge was a man who was looked up to, and Dodge was a man that other men were eager to work for. And in time, were eager to follow Dodge into battle. I mean, people want to be with a winner, right? And Dodge just seemed to exude, a winner with a capital W. So, when the panic spread and Atkins' methods appeared to fail, Dodge raised what became an elite force of mounted rangers from among his miners and the other men in the mining region of Wisconsin. And he set off with those citizen soldiers who seemed tougher, smarter, and more determined than the professional soldiers who were with Atkins. Dodge set out to hunt the sock down and to destroy it. See, heroic guys want to leave no ambiguity. I mean, it's just like, well, let's not negotiate, let's not dick around, that always takes time. Just better to like make a statement and just wipe them out, and everybody will remember that, and there'll be no ambiguity left. No ambiguity left. So Dodge's plan was to be heroic, decisive, and unambiguous. It's just like, isn't that the problem with some of our political leaders? Isn't that why we're still worrying about the debt ceiling? It's like, God, cut that through the crappy ambiguity and do something. So Dodge was going to hunt the sock down and wipe them out. And with stoic self-discipline, he pursued them through swamps and thick forests and rainstorms and over what were being described by the Illinois militia as the mountains of Wisconsin, down around Spring Creek. And in that kind of unrelenting determination, Dodge drove his men and drove himself through torrential rains, debilitating heat, to the limit of their endurance, to the limited endurance of their horses, and then even beyond that. This was a guy who was determined. This was a guy who was like, wow, some land-bound Captain Ahab in pursuit, of a red-skinned Moby Dick. And he wouldn't rest until he had dealt with the monster. And so what happens is that Dodge chases them, discovers that they're out of the swamps in Lake Koshkonong and they're heading west. So the Winnebago guides say, boy, you guys need to get west, and you need to get lost in the forest. Dodge picks up the trail. Boy, he takes after them. He chases them through the area that later becomes Madison, through Four Lakes and up over Bascom Hill. And if you go to Bascom Hill this day, there's a monument up on Bascom Hill by Liz Waters, the dormitory that used to be just for women. And then off into the thick forest to the northwest of that. And then on July the 21st, late in the day, late in the afternoon, July the 21st, he catches up with them. All this driving, all this endurance, all this determination. Oh, God, it's paying off. July the 21st, 179 years ago, he catches them near the Wisconsin River, near Sauk Prairie. They're on the east side. Catches them on the high ground, and attacks in the midst of a torrential summer thunderstorm. In tall grass, and shoots them up. Kills a lot of people that day. And as it gets dark, the good old trickster, the good old shapeshifter, Blackhawk, the Indians vanish. And what Blackhawk does is he gets his people to the Mississippi River, and then, with troops not far away, he manages to get them across. Some of them make makeshift canoes and head down the Wisconsin River. Did I say Wisconsin or did I say Mississippi? I'm sorry. He gets them across the Wisconsin River. Some of them make makeshift canoes and head down. Mostly women with children. And most of those women and children die. Never make it down to the Mississippi and across the Iowa again. And the rest of them, with horses still strong enough to carry a load or carry a rider, they strike out across territory, heading for the Mississippi. But Dodge, in what becomes known as the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, Dodge, who already had a reputation, among the miners, among the people of the driftless area, after the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, the 21st of July, 1832, Dodge becomes national news. Dodge becomes national news, and indeed, Dodge becomes a national celebrity. And Dodge has basically almost everything he wants. He's famous. He's heroic. He's done what the regular army couldn't do. He's done what the United States government had failed to do. And of course, Dodge becomes famous, and hey, what happens? Dodge becomes the first governor of the Wisconsin Territory. And then Dodge, right here, becomes the first United States senator elected from Wisconsin. And Dodge has a son, who, in time, becomes the first United States senator from the state of Iowa. And they are both in the Senate at the same time, and it's Henry Dodge and his son. Now get this name. Talk about a guy that's got ambition coming out of his pores. His son's name is Caesar Augustus Dodge. Now, that's a man with an empire on his mind, right? So what happens? Well, Dodge doesn't relent, but Dodge hooks up with Atkinson and what's left of the Illinois militia that's still in service, and they follow the Indian Trail across and through the woods, and, through the dense, and on August the 1st, the Indians reach the Mississippi River. They think they're well ahead of their pursuers. And so they camp on the east bank of the Mississippi River the night of August the 1st, intending to get across the river the next morning. They don't have canoes, but they have horses, and they can make it over, and they're making log rafts. But before they're able to get off the riverbank, the next morning, about 10 o'clock, the Sauk are descended upon by a force of 4,000 troops. 4,000 troops. And what grass before the side, and the banks of the river and the water changed color, quote, tainted by the blood of the Indians who were shot on the margin and in the stream. And when it was all over, about 1 o'clock, when it was all over, there were only 39 Sauk women and children left alive to round up and make prisoners. 39 out of what? 69? 39. I mean, what could be a more decisive victory than that? And in fact, the place where it happened was named and is named now Victory. And there's no town there. It's a place on the map called Victory. So, what we have is we have an unambiguous conclusion to the Blackhawk War. A triumph of American frontiersmen over the savages, a triumph of the American frontiersmen, over the United States Army and the efforts of the United States federal government. We have a heroic race of folks here. After the war was over, the first thing that was done is there were treaty conferences held with all the tribes still living in Wisconsin. The Winnebago, who hadn't participated in it at all, except a couple people had been guides, and provided some corn. The Potawatomi, who hadn't been in on it at all, except maybe in one of the raids in northern Illinois. The Ojibwe, who were living further north, but who hadn't been in on it at all. But nevertheless, the United States government suspected all the Indians, wanted to reduce all and eliminate all ambiguity, and therefore had treaties were made, hard and fast treaties were made, through which all those tribes signed on the line and would be removed. The Indian Removal Act? Indian Removal Act of 1832? Would be removed from the territory east of the Mississippi River and resettled forever until, as long as the sky was blue and the grass was green. They would always live on the other side of the veil, on the other side of the water. Now, what happens is, of course, is that with that decisive, unambiguous defeat of the Indians, suddenly, Wisconsin is up for sale and open for settlement. No more reasons to be fearful. No more reasons to worry about whether you were settling on Indian land or not. And so, really, the Blackhawk War, as short as it was, as inexpensive as it was to the United States government, nevertheless, really, truly is the beginning of the history of Wisconsin, which, from that point on, of course, moved forward, you know, on a progressive course to a better future. All right, I'm done. Now the thing is that what I just told you is a pretty simple-minded summary of what really all happened. And in order for you to know what really happened, you've got to either check this out at the library or buy it. All right, anybody got questions? Is anybody, like, I'm hot, are you? Yeah, go ahead.
At what point did they go to a ceremonial ground? There were a bunch of mounds that were, I'm trying to say, they had used for markers for decide what the seasons were. Also, at one point, the Indians used to all gather there. Where was that place? And then right after that.
Well, for the Sauk, it was Saukenuk, you know. That was regarded as the sacred center of the world. I mean, that was where huh?
Where is that?
Oh, Saukenuk. And as a matter of fact, I did a lecture down in Augustana College, you know, which is in Rock Island, Illinois. And Augustana College is very, very close to where the Sauk had their summertime village. So it's you know, the Rock River comes down, you know, through Janesville, through Beloit, and then all down, and then flows into the Mississippi River. And about 2 miles up the Rock River from the mouth was this place. And the reason why it was so good is that it was protected by a kind of it's almost in an amphitheater. There's like bluffs that you know that are to the north and to the east, and then there's a floodplain there that apparently was high enough that it didn't flood so much. And all the soil there was incredibly rich, and you know just made for farming. It was made for corn growing and squash and beans and that. And the Indian women had these huge fields, you know, these huge fields, and there was and so it just seemed like, you know, I think there was if you watch PBS, if you watch public television, there's a thing about, I think, Yellowstone Park about saying they showed this you know, these scenes from Yellowstone. They said, oh gosh, you know, there are some places in the world that are just like paradise. And then they go on to show that there's trouble in paradise. You know, I mean, what isn't in trouble, I guess. But that area, even now, which is well, there are some houses on it, but much of it is still open and not developed. Even now, it's just like, oh my God, yeah, wouldn't this be a nice place to be? So I think in searching the world, or at least their world, they came upon this area and it was like, this is it. This has got to be the center of the world. This has got to be where the magic is the strongest. This has got to be where the music of the drum communicates to the spirit world most clearly. And so yeah, but you know, this is fairly common among human beings. You know, I mean, it's like certainly the Hebrews thought the same about Jerusalem, and certainly the Romans, probably to this day, you know, think that Rome is the center of the world. And have you ever talked to like a verbally aggressive New Yorker? I mean, it's like, wow. And while we know that Portage may be in fact pretty close to the center of this world, right? Isn't it really like kind of like, and the veil is real thin. You know, you know, the gap between the past and the present is gosh, almost non-existent. So, Okay,
What happened to Blackhawk after the war?
gosh, you know the downer thing about Blackhawk is that even before, after the war, you know, the night of August the 1st, while they're camping on the east bank of the Mississippi River, Blackhawk and some of his cronies desert and head up into Wisconsin, up to a place where they hide out along the Black River, and then eventually Blackhawk and the Winnebago Prophet give themselves up. They give themselves up, and Blackhawk becomes a prisoner. And it's at that point where there starts to be kind of a double exposure. You know, Henry Dodge, certainly in the West, comes out as the most heroic guy, but Blackhawk and his son, who was, oh God, you know, his son, I guess, was the most good-looking, best-looking Indian man that there'd ever been. You know, they're imprisoned at Jefferson Barracks, south of St. Louis, and there's this parade of artists. You know, among them George Kaplan was the really famous that come and paint Blackhawk and his son during the winter and the spring of 1832, 1833. And then after that, Blackhawk is taken east to Washington, D.C., where he receives a lecture from President Jackson, and then is put in a prison at Fort Monroe. And again, you know, people come and, you know, paint his pictures. And then just to like teach him a lesson, to show him that, you know, you don't throw stones at Superman, and you don't spit into the wind, and you don't mess with the United States. In order to give Blackhawk and his lieutenants an idea of the strength and the power and the population of the United States, he's forced to do a tour of the eastern cities. First of all, Washington D.C., and then in Baltimore, and then Philadelphia, and New York City, and you know what happens? He becomes a rock star. I mean, you know, people have heard about this guy. People have, you know, and there's a lot of sympathy towards the Indians in the East, where they've never seen an Indian. He'll go, and it's these huge crowds, and I mean, there's women that swoon, especially over the son, you know, and his son, and he becomes a bigger. There's one point in Baltimore where Blackhawk and President Jackson are in a theater at the same time, and Blackhawk gets more applause than Jackson, and Jackson's pissed. And he sulks out, and, you know, goes back to the White House. But it's a tour that gets out of hand, because, you know, there's thousands of people that are turning out to see him. He's you know, he's big stuff. And he goes back home. He's released, and he goes back home. In the summer of 1833, he goes to Fort Armstrong, and he sits down with a guy by the name of Anton Leclerc, who's fluent in, you know, 6 or 7 Indian languages. He's like John Kinsey, and he dictates his autobiography, which then is published and becomes a national bestseller. And you have to remember, this is the time in which, you know, in 1829, James Fenimore Cooper had published Last of the Mohicans, and so there's a romance about all this stuff. And Blackhawk, without even knowing it, or perhaps by knowing it, and being really the ultimate trickster, you know, taps in on that and becomes an incredibly famous man. And that's in some ways where real value comes out. Because, you know, Blackhawk's autobiography is the first time you get the version of the American frontier advance from the side of the other. From the side of the other. And it really raises some questions about just how good is the Republic in terms of its moral actions towards the native people. It really does sort of stir up a real debate. So, yeah, and then he lives on, I think, another 10 years. He gives up not doing alcohol, does alcohol. and he ends up, you know, dressing in white people's clothes. And you go to the, I think it's the state senate chambers. These are very nice original cabin painting of Blackhawk in, you know, in a royal blue and red collar, military tunic. So he becomes a kind of celebrity, and dies. I mean, I think he lives until he's 75 years old. So.
One more question, public question, then you can answer maybe afterward.
Well, there was a woman back here that had a question.
He asked the same question.
Okay. Are my answers too long? I mean, honestly, you know, I want you to sweat it out here.
I just wanted to know, like, the Sauk, how do they fit in? Who are they related to?
They're Algonquin-speaking people. They're related to the Ojibwe. They're related to the Potawatomi. And Ottawa, etc. I mean, there's this huge language family that all speak, you know, a version of the same language, slightly different dialects and things like that. And the Sauk and the Musqueam, the Fox, are part of that. And like the other Algonquin people, migrated west during the 17th century, during the fur trade wars, the Iroquois. The Iroquois were just like blowing everybody away. In New York and Pennsylvania and Ontario, and people just pick up and leave. And they come to Wisconsin. And they settle in two places initially. They settle at the bottom of Green Bay, not the bottom under the water, but you know, down at the mouth of the Fox River. And then at you know, at the Apostle Islands, on Madeline Island in that area. The ones that were real scared went there. And then the Sauk migrate down and have a village at the center of the world before they go to Saugatuck at Sauk City. But now it's Sauk City. It was a huge village. And then I suppose the cornfields got kind of replenished. What is it? Depleted. I've been retired now, so I hardly ever talk to anybody anymore. So, and then in the 1750s they moved to the site in Illinois. So. Is that it?
Yeah, a couple things.
Destiny is not it's going to cut you off.
Sorry.
No ambiguity here. It's done.
We have like 5 or 6 copies of his book available. I think I'll sign them for you if anyone wants to grab those ones in the gift shop. And also we have like 5 or 6 copies of Blackhawk's autobiography in the gift shop.
Oh yeah.
We haven't got many.
The new one or the old one?
I don't know.
Okay.
I guess,
There's a new one, and the guy from Louisiana State University did the editor.
I don't think so. I think it's an older
Okay.
than one. The last thing, of course, I have to mention is I really appreciate the donations you can give tonight. There's a box on the food table and a box by the door when you head out. These are this free lecture made available by a grant, but we don't know how long that will keep going. Of course, if you want to see this happening again,
Obviously this is a good program. I mean, there's.
obviously.
I mean, honestly, everybody is such a good audience, and it's such a large number of people.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I used to teach